Thank you. As I was reflecting on vulnerability in preparation for today's service, I couldn't help but see vulnerability everywhere. There are so many ways to be vulnerable in our crazy, frightening, and chaotic world, and so many who are vulnerable. It was hard to bring focus to my thoughts to decide how to engage with vulnerability. I always do better when I extrapolate from personal experience, and this led me to COVID-19 and how the pandemic has increased my personal sense of vulnerability in the world. We've lived through the depths of the pandemic together, and I suspect I'm not the only one experiencing an increase in a feeling of vulnerability. Prior to the emergence of COVID, I felt generally safe in the world. I had a stable home and family. I had work to do that helped me feel valuable in the world. I had everything I needed. That isn't to say that I never felt vulnerable. I did. And I knew that I was more fortunate and less vulnerable than many. 3 years later, the circumstances of my life have not changed very much, but I feel changed in some essential way by the experience of the global pandemic. I feel vulnerable in a way that I never did before. And I have to admit, the world looks scarier day by day and week by week. The pandemic hit me hard and fast at my emotional core, and I was engulfed with overwhelming fear. One of my adult children was living in New York City at the onset of the pandemic. She was working remotely, alone in her apartment. She heard sirens throughout the day. She saw neighbors leave their apartments on stretchers, and 800 people were dying every day in New York City. And then she got sick too. She couldn't stand up long enough to shower. Coughing fits made her fall to the floor. She had no thermometer, no Advil, the stores were closed, and the mail system was seriously disrupted. She was sick for weeks, and her recovery was slow. She was vulnerable. My family was vulnerable. We were all vulnerable. So many people died, many of them alone. COVID was politicized, leading to more illness and death, and life was disrupted for so many for a long time. Now the pandemic has morphed into something else. Many of us are at least partially protected from the ever-evolving virus, either through vaccination or prior infection. And COVID is still with us. People are still getting sick, and COVID still kills. As humans, we tend to move on emotionally when immediate danger has passed, and I feel myself doing this. But there is value in remembering. I'm going to pause now, and Julia is going to light a candle of remembrance. And I'm going to ask you to hold a moment of silence as we gaze at the flame, to remember those we lost, to remember those who grieve, to remember feeling vulnerable. As I look back, I remember how feeling vulnerable affected my mental and physical state. I had trouble focusing. I was frequently irritable. I had trouble sleeping. My heart palpitations went crazy. If I walked around the block, I became irrationally angry if someone walked by who wasn't wearing a mask. Didn't they know they could be leaving a trail of viral particles behind them? One of the ways I coped was to limit my exposure to the news. I looked at the front page of the paper. after letting the paper age for a couple of days, so those viral particles would become inactive. Yeah, I'm not the only one who did that, right? I read it just enough to be generally aware and also protect myself from the unending news cycle. When I tried to read a new book or watch a new movie, I stopped at the first hint of trauma, the first hint of an unhappy ending. Instead, I read books I had read before. I watched movies I had watched before. These are my safe, dependable friends. I'm wondering if any of you found similar respite. Did your reading choices change? Did you engage in any binge watching? How did you cope? What did you do? And throughout the pandemic, our UUCR community was still here for us. It's quite amazing how we pulled together to stay connected to each other, to care for each other during a time of vulnerability. I remain deeply grateful for all of the hours donated, all of the skills and resources shared that enabled us to join together in community, to worship together online. I looked forward to logging onto Zoom on Sunday morning, and my sense of connection to our UUCR community expanded and deepened. Lately, I've been reading the news in more depth. I am more able to engage with difficult topics, and I feel myself moving forward. I would not want to go back to the earlier phases of the pandemic, and I would not choose to feel so vulnerable again. But I am grateful for the experience of deep vulnerability. Many in our human family are vulnerable from hour to hour, day to day, year to year. Targeted or excluded based on their identity, lacking enough food to eat or adequate shelter, living with violence, living in isolation, or threatened in other ways. I think that, in a small way, I have a better and more compassionate understanding of the effects of sustained vulnerability on the health and well-being of individuals, families, and communities. I feel humbled by the direct experience of vulnerability. I wonder if any of you are thinking, but it's not just COVID. And I'm thinking that too. There's so much exclusion, so much injustice, so much violence, the breakdown of civil discourse, climate instability. I see vulnerability everywhere, and I sometimes wonder if there is any good news. I ask, what can I do? What can any one person do? And I think that's where the good news lies, that we are not alone. We can face the future together. We can work together as a loving community of intention and action. And so I will end with an invitation and a challenge, and that is simply, let's be vulnerable together.
When asked to write a reflection on vulnerability, it was hard to consider it in anything other than the positive sense. Often we use the term to refer to the vulnerability which can be forced upon us against our will. However, for me, the lessons of the past few years have been about remembering to choose to be more open with those around me. While the shiny armor of long ago acquired defenses feels safe and secure, it prevents us from touching those that we interact with. Many of my interactions these days are accompanied by frequent internal reminders to ask myself, in each situation, do I really need to be as guarded as I am in this moment? For instance, using irony as a common defense, we often talk about something important to us, but sheath it in a layer of faint irony to lend an air of plausible deniability if it doesn't land. But this does mean that when it would have resonated with the person across from us, we are robbed of the chance to share that moment in connection. Or worse, if it's something important to them as well, we might end up hurting them with our guarded words, which they take to mask disapproval of the very thing we care about. Hesitant to expose myself to potential barbs, I found that I had practiced hiding my feelings in nearly all cases. At one point, I was proud that my practiced, constant deadpan was so successful that no one could ever tell whether I was serious or not. In hindsight, this was a strange thing to take pride in, but goes to show just how vigilant we can be in avoiding vulnerability. I think despite this, we ultimately want to be seen as us, the real us, and to be accepted and not judged for that person. While that judgment, and the pain that comes with it, is a very real risk of expressing oneself, to never do so is to miss finding the spaces, times, and people that would allow for it. As a trans woman, vulnerability has a particular and specific meaning to me. There's something about asking the world to consider you differently than what they think they see or hear, or perhaps even to see something different. For a long time, it felt like an impossibly large ask, like I was putting too much burden on those around me to ever do it, selfish to consider it. But when I'd see other trans folk, that's not how I'd feel about it. I would instead focus on the naked vulnerability they would display. It helped put things into context. There's a look to it, a certain facial expression. It's a combination of hope, fear, optimism, and joy all mixed into one. Fear that you'll get harassed or rejected. The optimism to stand upright and face it anyway, all fueled by the hope and joy of the experiences of being yourself and seeing it validated. One of the hardest moments of accepting vulnerability was in coming out to my wife, Dawn, knowing that it would redefine and shake our relationship. There was so much potential for hurt there, and in many ways we did hurt one another. However, even in those early first days of her truly starting to see me as me, were worth an inconceivable amount. While there were many milestones and firsts along this journey, hearing her call me wife for the first time might take the prize for the most impactful. What resonated inside sang so much louder than I knew was possible. The mutual willingness to be vulnerable has ushered in a new sense of openness and connection between us, and somehow left us stronger for it. We hope to someday renew our vows in the context of a truer understanding of each other. Taking those steps, Taking those steps started a cascade of opening to what else I was holding back for fear of rejection. Whether simple things like fondness for a certain song, big things like wanting to go back to school, or more complex things such as admitting to the depth of the emotions that dwelled inside. While it has been a continuing challenge of accepting the risk that comes with opening oneself up to rejection, the change has been huge. Many people have known me for a long time have remarked on my smile now. In the times past, I never would. Despite the potential costs of being my authentic and vulnerable self, the benefits are written apparent on my face every day now, when smiling comes as automatic as breathing. One long-standing, unexpressed desire was to find a place to explore my sense of faith and spirituality. I held off partly because of the feelings of my social circle, partly for some unfortunate past experiences, but mostly just out of fear of opening up to that side of myself to others. I was so nervous coming into this congregation for the first time. However, I did notice the bright and colorful proclamations of inclusion that adorn this space. It's easy to be cynical about things like this, and it perhaps even made me a bit wary. Nevertheless, the services seem to echo the same message, and then more importantly, the people do too. Many have welcomed me with words and actions, engaged me in discussions, and even encouraged me to share my thoughts and feelings. I'm again so glad that I was willing to suspend my fear for long enough to take that step, open myself to the potential hurts, and realize how much kinder people can be than our insecurities try to convince us. I think this congregation's theme of inclusion and the desire to push the circle outward and embrace and gain from the perspective of those not quite like us is itself in line with the message of vulnerability. It's always more comfortable and feels safer to keep to what we know, to avoid change and to keep the walls up. I've learned a lot in my short while of being here from those that are the heart of this place. Being willing to adapt, explore new ways of looking at the world, or even stand up and give voice to words of acceptance, despite fears of making mistakes, is a meaningful gift the congregation gives to itself as much as it does to others.